The Supremacy Clause is clear. Federal acts are not always supreme. The run for the border. It's one of the classic plot lines in cops and robbers movies. Why do the bad guys always desperately try to get across that imaginary line? Well, it's because they realize that the police don't have any jurisdiction on the other side of the border. If you grasp this concept, then it's easy to understand federal supremacy in the Constitution. The federal government has certain powers, but it can only act within its sphere of authority. Once the feds cross that border into the realm of state powers, they don't have any authority at all. Alexander Hamilton explained this concept when arguing in favor of the Constitution in a paper called Federalist No. 33. He wrote, "It will not, I presume, have escaped observation that it expressly confines this supremacy to laws made pursuant to the Constitution." And what should be done with federal laws that aren't supreme? Hamilton, like other founders, told us just what to do. These will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. The common view of the Marbury versus Madison case is a myth. Many people believe that Marbury versus Madison established the Supreme Court as the sole, exclusive, and final authority of what the Constitution says and means. According to this myth, the Supreme Court's opinions are the law of the land, never to be questioned by anybody ever again. People who believe in this myth say that Chief Justice John Marshall made this the case through his own opinion in Marbury. But Marshall said no such thing, ever. Believers point to one sentence in the Marbury opinion to back up this myth. It is emphatically the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. If you take that on its own without any context, you might think Marshall was really saying the court had exclusive authority to interpret the Constitution. But in reality, he was just asserting the power of judicial review. Marshall never said the Supreme Court has the sole or exclusive authority to determine what the Constitution means, not even in Marbury. In fact, he said the court itself was bound by the Constitution. He wrote, "The particular phraseology of the Constitution confirms and strengthens the principle that a law repugnant to the Constitution is void, and that courts, as well as other departments, are bound by that instrument." Nowhere does the Constitution give any federal court supreme authority over the other two branches, much less the states. This is a myth. The Constitution itself is supreme, not the opinion of any person or group of people in any branch of government. Is every act of the federal government supreme? Well, if you want to follow the Constitution, the answer is no. Here's how most Americans think. The Supremacy Clause says every federal law is supreme. But in Federalist No. 33, Alexander Hamilton said we should look at certain federal acts in a completely different way. He said, "These will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such." Given the Supremacy Clause, how can any federal act be an act of usurpation? The confusion arises because people leave out key words in the Supremacy Clause itself. They are "in pursuance thereof." When the people of the several states agreed to a constitution and entered into a larger political union, it was understood that laws pursuant to the Constitution would be supreme. That's all the Supremacy Clause tells us, and really, it's just common sense. But as Hamilton explained, it doesn't follow from this doctrine that acts of the federal government which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers will become the supreme law of the land. In fact, these are invasions of the residual powers of the people and the states. Think of it like trespassing. When the feds act outside their powers, they step over the line onto the property of the people and the states. Federal acts like this are nothing more than a usurpation, and they should be treated that way too. James Madison's Federalism flip-flop reveals just how powerful the states really are. Just under 6 weeks before the start of the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, James Madison sent a letter to George Washington with his ideas on how a new government should be structured. In what came to be known as the Virginia Plan, Madison proposed a form of government far more centralized than what would eventually be adopted by the convention and ratified by the people of the several states. In one notable section of his letter, Madison told Washington that a national government should have a veto power over all acts of the state governments. While we might think of this as an aggressive power, Madison thought of it as defensive. He wrote, "Without this defensive power, every positive power that can be given on paper will be evaded and defeated." In short, Madison knew then that states had the power to defeat federal programs. The final version of his proposal was included as Resolution 6 when Edmund Randolph presented the Virginia Plan on May 29th. Madison, Randolph, and others also called for the new government to have power to use the full force of the Union against any state that didn't comply. This plan was rejected by the convention, and a national veto never made it into the Constitution. Less than 1 year later, though, Madison was singing a different tune. In Federalist 46, one of a series of essays published to help sell ratification of the Constitution in New York, Madison made the case that the ability to evade and defeat federal measures was a benefit for the states. In what has come to be known as the anti-commandeering doctrine, Madison pointed out that if individuals and states merely refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union, they have the power to undermine and end federal programs, constitutional or not. Did Madison simply flip-flop? Did he have a change of heart? Or did he just have a willingness to give up some features he wanted in order to get the document ratified? I honestly don't know the answer, but we'll continue looking for clues. Either way, here's the bottom line. Feature or flaw, states are not required to help enforce federal acts or regulatory programs. And opting out of them is a powerful strategy to bring them to an end. Here's what we're supposed to do when the federal government violates our rights. When faced with unconstitutional or just plain bad federal policy, people generally try 3 things. They contact representatives in Congress in the hopes that federal politicians will limit federal power. Or they sue in federal court and hope the politically connected federal lawyers who serve as judges will limit federal power. Or they go to the polls to vote the bums out with the hope that the new federal politicians won't be bums too, and they'll limit federal power. When you stop to think about it, none of this makes any sense at all. They're asking Washington, D.C. to fix itself, which never seems to happen. Even Alexander Hamilton understood this. When confronted with the question of how the people would guard their liberties if the new government violated them, Hamilton didn't recommend doing anything at the national level. In Federalist Paper number 28, he said the solution would lie with the states. He wrote, "It may safely be received as an axiom in our political system that the state governments will, in all possible contingencies, afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. In 1813, Thomas Jefferson gave us an example that modern politicians should learn from. It's tough to find politicians who put constitutional principles above their own policy agendas. Generally, when they want to do something, they'll find some excuse, no matter what the Constitution says. But this isn't something that's new. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton led the drive to charter a national bank. At the time, Jefferson argued it was unconstitutional. He wrote, "The incorporation of a bank and the powers assumed by this bill have not, in my opinion, been delegated to the United States by the Constitution." But over the constitutional objections of Jefferson, along with James Madison and many others, Congress still chartered the first bank of the United States. The bank operated for 20 years, but in 1811, Jefferson refused to support the drive for a new bank, and Congress ultimately failed to recharter it. In a letter to Thomas Law, Jefferson wrote, "The other idea of creating a national bank I do not concur in, because it seems now decided that Congress has not that power, although I sincerely wish they had it exclusively." What does that mean? Even though Jefferson actually supported the idea of having a national bank in theory at that time, he still opposed it in practice because he believed it violated the Constitution. The General Welfare Clause does not give the federal government the power to do anything it wants. Where do the feds get the power to run things like healthcare or education or a retirement system? A lot of people will say, why, the General Welfare Clause gives it to them, of course. But if the General Welfare Clause empowers the federal government to do anything and everything, why would the framers of the Constitution follow that clause with a list of specific enumerated powers? Wouldn't the General Welfare Clause just cover it all? So why make a list in the first place? As Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist Paper number 83, the list of particulars in Article 1, Section 8 would be absurd as well as useless if a general authority was intended. He continued by saying the grant of specific powers following the General Welfare Clause evidently excludes all pretension to a general legislative authority. As James Madison put it in Federalist number 45, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. If the General Welfare Clause gave the feds power to do anything under the guise of general welfare, it would turn the federal government into one of virtually unlimited power. It's clear that the specific powers enumerated after the clause limit the federal government's power to spend for the general welfare to specific objects. As Madison put it, to read it as a sweeping grant of power would be a metamorphosis of the Constitution into a character which there is a host of proofs was not contemplated by its creators. Never, ever, ever give any politician the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes people get more relaxed about following the Constitution when their preferred politician or party is in power. For instance, a President Trump supporter told us he was concerned about Jeff Sessions and his directive to ratchet up asset forfeiture. But then he said we should give the president the benefit of the doubt that, quote, he's using the law just to get bad guys. He trusts his guy to do the right thing with his power, so he's willing to give his president a pass. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, offered some better advice. Don't trust any of them, ever, even when your own team is in charge. He said, "In questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution." Don't submit, resist. In March of 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, imposing a comprehensive schedule of taxes on all kinds of commercial and legal documents and transactions. It covered everything from wills, court actions, mortgages, insurance policies, pamphlets, newspapers, and even things like playing cards. But instead of meekly submitting and following the law, people in the colonies organized to resist the Stamp Act. In one important move, Richard Henry Lee threatened a boycott of British goods in Virginia until Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. At the time, this was essentially an act of treason. But more than 100 Virginia planters signed Lee's protest and committed to the boycott. Their actions inspired people in other colonies to follow suit. Some 200 merchants in New York City, 250 in Boston, and 400 in Philadelphia pledged to stop importing all but a few goods from England as long as the Stamp Act remained in effect. In October 1765, just 2 weeks before the act was set to go into legal effect, John Hancock sent a letter to his London agent, Jonathan Bernard, capturing the spirit of the time. He wrote, "The people of this country will never suffer themselves to be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act." Hancock was right. Within 3 months of his letter, merchants in England crippled by the boycotts were warning Parliament that if normal trade wasn't restored soon, they faced bankruptcy. On top of that, colonial resistance was so intense, the British couldn't enforce the act. And just 4.5 months after it went into effect, Parliament repealed it. When it comes down to it, opinions are just opinions. Constitutionally, war and peace aren't the president's decision. The founding generation went out of their way to ensure this kind of unilateral decision-making would never happen. Under the Constitution, the power to make decisions about whether to go to war or not is delegated to Congress. The founders wanted to ensure that a body directly accountable to the people made these decisions, not a single individual subject to emotional whims. This is how James Madison described it in a letter to Thomas Jefferson. He wrote, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature." But for many decades, Congress has completely abandoned its constitutional responsibility. It could easily render the president's opinion about war moot. Instead, we have exactly what the founding generation went to great pains to avoid. Presidents, in effect, exercising royal prerogative and single-handedly marching American soldiers off to die on foreign battlefields. That's not the president's decision to make. At least not if the Constitution was followed as ratified. Patrick Henry did not want to make America great. A lot of people today seem to think the greatness of a country is in the size and scope of its government. They'll point to the things it provides, like healthcare, social programs, and other various services. Or they'll talk about its military power and its place on the world stage. It wasn't any different during America's founding. After the Revolution, some people wanted to create a strong, centralized government so America could be great. During the Virginia Ratifying Convention, Patrick Henry was afraid the United States would end up with a powerful, consolidated national government, and that it would overwhelm the states. He said this danger came because some people desired what he called a great, splendid government in order to create a great and mighty empire. He said the people yearning for this powerful government wanted it because we must have an army and a navy and a number of things. Henry urged convention delegates to remember the principles of the Revolution. He said, "When the American spirit was in its youth, the language of America was different. Liberty, sir, was then the primary object." The powers of a federal government are few and defined. Today, the federal government claims the authority to do just about everything under the sun, from telling us what kind of plants we can grow in our backyard to regulating the amount of water in our toilets. This is not what was promised. During the ratification debates, opponents of the Constitution feared the whole mass of powers held by the federal government would overwhelm the powers reserved to the states. In Federalist Paper number 45, James Madison forcefully argued that the Constitution wasn't set up that way. He wrote that the powers delegated to the federal government were few and defined. On the other hand, those remaining with the states are numerous and indefinite. Madison went on to explain that federal power would primarily be directed at external objects like foreign commerce and war and peace. Meanwhile, he said the powers reserved to the several states will extend to all objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. When you see how Madison broke it down, it's pretty clear that your toilet and plants grown in your backyard are not supposed to be subject to federal regulation under the Constitution. And the same goes for most everything else. How do you determine if something is constitutional? James Madison gave us a two-step process. Writing in his famous Report of 1800, James Madison argued that the Alien and Sedition Acts clearly violated the Constitution. Why? Because they failed a basic two-question test. First, Madison said, whenever a question arises concerning the constitutionality of a particular power, the first question is whether the power is expressed in the Constitution. If it be, the question is decided. But that doesn't settle the question in every situation. We also have to consider the necessary and proper clause. Madison said if a power to take a given action isn't explicitly in the Constitution's text, the next inquiry must be whether it is properly an incident to an express power and necessary to its execution. In other words, if the action is absolutely necessary to carry out a power that is clearly spelled out in the Constitution, and it is a proper or customary way of doing so, then, as Madison put it, it may be exercised by Congress. If it be not, Congress cannot exercise it. And that sums up James Madison's simple two-step process for deciding if a federal action is constitutional. Does the Constitution empower Congress to pass any and every law for the general welfare? Many Americans think it does because of the General Welfare Clause, but supporters of the Constitution during ratification said it did not. Edmund Randolph was a delegate to the Philadelphia Convention. He was initially opposed to the Constitution and refused to sign it. He later changed course and became a strong advocate at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. During those debates, he forcefully countered Patrick Henry's assertion that the General Welfare Clause would give the new government sweeping power. He said, "But the rhetoric of the gentleman has highly colored the dangers of giving the general government an indefinite power of providing for the general welfare. I contend that no such power is given." He went on to explain that the first clause of Article 1, Section 8 empowers Congress to collect taxes to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare, but it doesn't empower them to spend money. He continued, "Is this an independent, separate, substantive power to provide for the general welfare of the United States? No, sir. The power to spend money follows." Randolph later went on to say reading the General Welfare Clause as a broad grant of power would violate every rule of construction and common sense. Not valid. That's what Alexander Hamilton called any federal act contrary to the Constitution. In Federalist Paper No. 78, Hamilton wrote, "There is no position which depends on clearer principles than that every act of a delegated authority, contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised, is void." And from this, Hamilton drew the only logical conclusion. He wrote, "No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid." In a nutshell, Hamilton told us the federal government is not supreme. Whatever authority it has was delegated to it by a higher authority, the people of the several states. If the federal government exercises any power contrary to those delegated to it in the Constitution, the act is void. In other words, not valid or legally binding. That means any such unconstitutional acts should simply be ignored. Did you know your rights don't come from the Constitution or even the Bill of Rights? Today we're talking about the source of your rights and how you defend them. People often refer to their rights by amendment number. Doing so is not only a constitutional error, it's dangerous. Here are some examples you'll often hear. "Creating a free speech zone is a violation of my First Amendment rights." Or, "I will never let Bloomberg and his type take away my Second Amendment rights." The phrases First Amendment rights and Second Amendment rights, or any other amendment rights for that matter, imply that you get your rights as a grant from government or a document. People who hear these phrases learn that you get these rights because they're spelled out in the Bill of Rights. Some might even believe that they didn't exist until they were written down on paper. But nothing could be further from the truth. Your rights are yours by the very nature of your birth. You have them whether a document or a government says so or not. And while governments at every level will always work to limit or destroy your rights, it's up to you and others to defend them. Of course, the big question, how do you do that? Thomas Jefferson had what I believe to be the most important advice on this. He said, "A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature, and not as a gift of their chief magistrate." In other words, we the people need to learn how to exercise our rights, whether the government wants us to or not. The founders had many reasons for setting up a decentralized system. I'll share one of the most important ones next. In an 1800 letter, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Our country is too large to have all its affairs directed by a single government." Today, the federal government really does try to direct virtually all of our affairs, from what our kids learn in school, to what plants we can grow in our own yards, to how much water we can have in our toilets. This is the kind of micromanaging that the founders warned us about. Jefferson's point is pretty straightforward. Bureaucrats, hundreds or even thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., simply can't grasp all the issues facing a local community. Since there is no way for them to understand what's needed locally, we end up with one-size-fits-all solutions that don't work for anybody. But the flip side of the coin might be even more dangerous. We don't really know what's going on in Washington, D.C., and we have absolutely no control over it either. Jefferson warned us about this too. He said this kind of situation will invite public agents to corruption, plunder, and waste. You don't have to look around too much to see that that's exactly what we have today. The founders didn't trust the executive branch to exercise complete power over war. James Madison put it this way: the executive branch is the most interested in war and the most prone to it. The founders knew their history, so this was a common view. English kings took the country to war time and again, sometimes for the most trivial reasons. Because of this, the founders divided war powers. In the Constitution, Congress was delegated the power to declare war, that is, to decide if the country would go to war and against whom. The president was delegated the power to wage war once Congress declared it. Thomas Jefferson put it this way in a letter to James Madison. He said the Constitution creates one effectual check to the dog of war by transferring the power of letting him loose from the executive to the legislative body. Rights aren't gifts from government. Every so often, somebody tells us that non-citizens don't have rights in America. But this shows a complete misunderstanding of where rights come from. It implies that rights come from government. To say that non-citizens have no rights is absurd. You don't get rights because you were born inside some arbitrarily drawn border. Some people were simply lucky to be born in an area where government violates their rights less than in other areas. Fact: every person on earth was born with the same natural rights. Thomas Jefferson alluded to this in the Declaration of Independence. He wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." Of course, you don't have to believe in a creator. You can simply say that natural rights are a basic part of our personhood. To assume that government gives you rights takes you down a very dangerous path. After all, whatever government gives, government can take away. The Constitution delegates the power to declare war to Congress and not the president. A leading University of Virginia constitutional law professor did an in-depth study of the founding era understanding of the phrase, "to declare war." He concluded that the founders and the founding generation understood the phrase as meaning to decide to enter a war, and includes acts of war as well as formal declarations of war. In other words, the act of establishing a no-fly zone, ordering a drone strike, or dropping bombs is fundamentally a declaration of war, and the president doesn't have the constitutional authority to do it without authorization from Congress. Here's how George Washington put it: the Constitution vests the power of declaring war with Congress. Therefore, no offensive expedition of importance can be undertaken until after they have deliberated upon the subject and authorized such a measure. It wasn't just Thomas Jefferson and James Madison who supported nullification. During the 1788 Hillsborough Convention, delegates from North Carolina opposing ratification of the Constitution outnumbered those in favor by about 2-1. One of the greatest concerns was about the extent of powers delegated to the federal government, and the lack of a Bill of Rights at that time. Archibald McLean was a well-known attorney in the state and was a leader there in opposition to the Stamp Act years earlier. He argued in favor of ratification and suggested nullification as a response to federal overreach. He said, "If Congress should make a law beyond its powers and the spirit of the Constitution, should we not say to Congress, 'You have no authority to make this law. There are limits beyond which you cannot go. You cannot exceed the power prescribed by the Constitution. You are amenable to us for your conduct. That act is unconstitutional. We will disregard it and punish you for the attempt." Although ratification initially failed, McLean and other supporters of the Constitution in North Carolina continued to make the case that the new general government would be limited, and the state would have recourse if the feds overstepped their bounds. The state ratified a year later based largely on these arguments. Did you know the federal government shouldn't even be funding infrastructure? It might sound shocking, but it's true. In fact, James Madison actually vetoed a public works bill funding infrastructure in 1817, calling it unconstitutional. The bill was for constructing roads and canals and improving the navigation of watercourses in order to facilitate, promote, and give security to internal commerce among the several states. Virtually every American today would say that this is exactly what the feds should be doing, but the father of the Constitution disagreed. Madison said, "The legislative powers vested in Congress are specified and enumerated, and it does not appear that the power proposed to be exercised by the bill is among the enumerated powers, or that it falls by any just interpretation with the power to make laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution those or other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States." The amazing thing is that Madison actually favored the bill personally, but he vetoed it anyway because he put the Constitution above his personal policy preferences. That's the kind of integrity you should never count on from Washington, D.C. today. One of the most important founding fathers is someone that most people have never even heard of. John Dickinson is best known as the penman of the Revolution. In response to the hated Townshend Acts, he wrote a series of 12 essays known as Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. They were widely read in the colonies and acted as a driving force against the British. Dickinson was also a member of the Continental Congress, which coordinated resistance during the early years of the Revolutionary War. During his tenure, he drafted two important pre-war documents, a petition to the king and the Olive Branch Petition, both attempts to negotiate peace. But when negotiations failed, Dickinson wrote the final draft of the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. But despite his prominent role, he refused to sign the Declaration of Independence. It's because he believed the colonies should formally unite and seek foreign alliances first. To that end, Dickinson did agree to head a committee to draft up a constitution for the Union of the States. The committee presented Dickinson's first draft of the Articles of Confederation to the Congress on July 12, 1776. Dickinson later served as a Delaware delegate to the Philadelphia Convention that drafted the Constitution. He supported ratification with a series of essays known as the Fabius Letters. In these, he showed his strong support for state sovereignty. He wrote, "A territory of such extent as that of United America could not be safely and advantageously governed, but by a combination of republics, each retaining all the rights of supreme sovereignty, excepting such as ought to be contributed to the Union." John Dickinson was Delaware's wealthiest farmer and largest slaveholder. However, in 1777, he freed all of his slaves. In fact, he was the only founder to do so during the period of 1776 to 1786. When learning of his death, Thomas Jefferson wrote that John Dickinson was among the first of the advocates for the rights of his country, whose name will be consecrated in history as one of the great worthies of the Revolution. Even the father of the Constitution knew that a separation of powers wouldn't be enough to limit the power of the federal government. James Madison recognized that even with a good framework, government couldn't be trusted to follow the rules given to it. In Federalist No. 48, he wrote, "Will it be sufficient to mark with precision the boundaries of these departments in the constitution of the government, and to trust to these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power? But experience assures us that the efficacy of the provision has been greatly overrated, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary for the more feeble against the more powerful members of the government." Madison was saying that we need something outside the federal government to enforce the constitutional limits on federal power. Why? He referred to parchment barriers. Governments don't limit their own power, and documents simply can't enforce themselves. The Constitution is quite clear on war power. The power to declare war is found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 of the Constitution, on the other hand, refers to the President as the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. Taken together, this means that once war is declared by Congress, the President has the responsibility, as the Commander-in-Chief, to wage the war. Alexander Hamilton talked about this when he said that the President, while lacking the power to declare war, would have the direction of war when authorized. Preemptive strikes and undeclared offensive military expeditions are not powers delegated to the executive branch in the Constitution, and therefore are unconstitutional. Thomas Jefferson covered this quite eloquently when in 1801 he said that as president he was unauthorized by the Constitution, without the sanction of Congress, to go beyond the line of defense. When acting without a congressional declaration of war, the president is authorized only to repel a military invasion or a sudden attack. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, James Madison explained why the Constitution divided war powers this way. He wrote, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all government demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature." There simply is no debate. Congress, not the president, decides if the country will go to war and when. One of the most maligned parts of the Constitution is the so-called General Welfare Clause. Rather than admitting they're in favor of violating the Constitution, Supporters of various federal programs will often just twist the original meaning of constitutional clauses to fit what they want the government to do. The General Welfare Clause is in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution. It reads, "The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States." While some people like to claim that this means the federal government can tax and spend money on whatever it deems to fall under the general welfare, James Madison completely disagreed. In a 1792 letter to Edmund Pendleton, Madison explained the original legal meaning of the clause. He wrote, "If Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, the government is no longer a limited one possessing enumerated powers, but an indefinite one subject to particular exceptions." It is to be remarked that the phrase out of which this doctrine is elaborated is copied from the old Articles of Confederation, where it was always understood as nothing more than a general caption to the specified powers, and it is a fact that it was preferred in the new instrument for that very reason as less liable than any other to misconstruction. In other words, the federal government may provide for the general welfare, but it must do so within the scope of the powers delegated to it in the Constitution. If you're counting on a federal politician to do what you want them to do, you're going to be seriously disappointed. Here's how Patrick Henry put it in a 1788 speech. "Show me that age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were placed on the sole chance of their rulers being good men, without a consequent loss of liberty." In other words, relying heavily or solely on federal elections to get the job done is not just a failed strategy. It's dangerous. The United States are not one singular nation. Instead, the Constitution created a federal republic. This difference might seem like semantic nitpicking, but it is a very important distinction. In a national system, the central government has complete control. The states would be mere corporations subject to the will of the central authority. In a federal system, the general government can only exercise the limited powers delegated to it, and the states or people deal with almost everything else. It's no wonder that almost every Washington, D.C. politician and bureaucrat push so hard to sell the idea of one nation. Empowering a national government means more power for them and less liberty for you. But the founders never intended to create that kind of system. Even Alexander Hamilton made this clear in Federalist Number 32, where he wrote, "An entire consolidation of the states into one complete national sovereignty would imply an entire subordination of the parts, and whatever powers might remain in them would be altogether dependent on the general will. But the plan of the convention aims only at a partial union or consolidation. The state governments would clearly retain all rights of sovereignty which they before had, and which were not by that act exclusively delegated to the United States." Hamilton was far from alone, but during the Massachusetts ratification debates, Fisher Ames gave a stark warning that's been totally ignored over the last 100 years. He said a consolidation of the states would subvert the new Constitution. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. The Founding Fathers were virtually unanimous in their strong opposition to war as a policy. Few were more adamant about this view than James Madison. In 1795, he wrote, "Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few." Today, in the United States of America, you'll find the largest and most expensive military force in the history of the world, an unpayable national debt of $19 trillion and rising, and pretty massive taxes too. So if you're not already under the domination of the few, at this pace, you eventually will be. James Madison summed it up this way: no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. So the next time some politician promotes another war as a way to supposedly protect your freedom, don't believe them. They're lying to you. Where do you go to figure out the original meaning of the Constitution? Well, the source, the people who gave it legal force. This is exactly how Thomas Jefferson told us to do it as well. He said, "On every question of construction, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or intended against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed." Whenever there's a tragedy, people across the political spectrum call for government to do something. They don't seem to care if that something means violating the Constitution. They'll just say the document is outdated or the founders couldn't have foreseen the tragedy that just happened. This very popular and very unfortunate mentality has driven the federal government to do all kinds of unconstitutional things: wage costly and deadly wars, enact gun control measures, spy on everyone, mandate that people buy things, ban plants, take over airports, and so much more. Sometimes these measures are pushed by the left, and sometimes by the right. It's my view, though, that both sides work together against the Constitution and your liberty. All of this is based on fear. People are afraid that they're going to be hurt at every turn, so they cry out to the government to protect them. Their fear drives them to forget their liberty. Patrick Henry noticed this lack of backbone even in his day. In a 1788 speech, he said, "When the American spirit was in its youth, the language of America was different. Liberty, sir, was then the primary object." Today, things are much worse, and Ben Franklin's famous warning seems to be ignored at every turn. He wrote, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." Bottom line, there is no liberty versus safety debate. We can only be safe when we're free. Would government people ever lie to us about foreign threats as a way to get more power for themselves? Bring this up in a conversation, and you'll find most people will raise an eyebrow, or laugh at you, or call for tinfoil hats. But at least one leading founding father not only thought it was possible, but considered it the norm. In 1798, during the lead-up to the signing of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which among other things empowered wholesale deportation and the criminalization of free speech, James Madison made some observations about using fear to take liberty. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, he wrote, "Perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged against provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad." Remember that quote the next time you're told to give up a little liberty to get some temporary safety. Thomas Jefferson saw the 10th Amendment as the foundation of the Constitution. In his 1791 opinion against the constitutionality of a national bank, he wrote, "I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people." This probably comes as a surprise, but when Alexander Hamilton was arguing for ratification of the Constitution, he swerved into the truth and inadvertently made the case for nullification through non-cooperation. We'll talk about that next. In Federalist number 16, Hamilton was trying to convince his readers that the federal government needed more power than it had under the Articles of Confederation. As he saw it, one of the biggest problems was that under the Articles, the states had to act in order for anything to get done. For example, Congress could only make requests of funds to the states. It could not directly tax people, property, or commerce. If the states refused to fill a requisition, Congress was essentially powerless to enforce its will. And on this, Hamilton wrote, "If the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, they have only not to act, or to act evasively, and the measure is defeated." Well, this is exactly the situation we have today. Because of massive unconstitutional overreach, the federal government depends on state action to do almost everything. It needs state resources and state personnel to enforce its laws and implement its programs. By simply doing nothing, states have the power to stop federal actions dead in their tracks. Supporters of the monster state often refer to our work here at the 10th Amendment Center as anti-government. To them, of course, this label is a negative, but prominent founders like Thomas Paine would have disagreed. In Common Sense, he wrote, "Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one." In a world where government spies on you, lies to you, takes massive amounts of your money, wages wars in your name, restricts your right to defend yourself, being anti-government isn't a bad thing. It's a badge of honor. In Federalist number 48, James Madison described constitutions as parchment barriers. He wrote, "Will it be sufficient to mark with precision the boundaries of these departments in the Constitution of the government, and to trust to these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power?" He also said that something else other than the Constitution is needed for enforcement, no matter how good the Constitution might be. This is the security which appears to have been principally relied on by the compilers of most of the American constitutions. But experience assures us that the efficacy of the provision has been greatly overrated, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary for the more feeble against the more powerful members of the government. Here's the short version. Constitutions don't enforce themselves, and governments will never limit their own power. Almost a decade before the Declaration of Independence, John Dickinson, often referred to as the penman of the Revolution, gave some timeless strategic advice on how to approach government overreach. Starting in 1767, in response to the Townshend Acts, John Dickinson wrote a series of 12 essays known as Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. In his first, he spent time discussing the last of the acts, the New York Restraining Act, which was punishment for the Assembly of New York, suspending its legislative powers for failing to fully comply with orders from the Crown. Dickinson wrote, "If the Parliament may lawfully deprive New York of any of her rights, it may deprive any or all the other colonies of their rights, and nothing can possibly so much encourage such attempts as a mutual inattention to the interests of each other. To divide and thus to destroy is the first political maxim in attacking those who are powerful by their union." He continued to say that, in essence, the rightful response at that moment would have been for other assemblies to have passed a non-binding resolution informing Parliament that the act was a violation of rights and that it should be repealed. Why? Well, his answer came through clearly in his signature, where he wrote the Latin phrase Concordia res parve crescunt. It means small things grow great by concord. Clearly, the penman of the revolution was right, and small things did grow great in the coming years. In many ways, today's federal government has suspended the legislative power of state governments by assuming control over powers never delegated to the federal government by the Constitution. In recent years, we've seen glimpses of small things growing great once again. In 2007 and 2008, the simple introduction of non-binding state resolutions affirming the 10th Amendment has grown into a movement. What is the federal government constitutionally authorized to do? The short answer, according to James Madison that is, not a whole lot. You'll often hear us talk about the feds being limited to enumerated powers. But what exactly does that mean? It's not nearly as complicated as it might seem. In fact, James Madison explained the basic structure of the American constitutional system in a single paragraph of Federalist Paper number 45. The so-called Father of the Constitution wrote that powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined. Those left to the states are numerous and indefinite. That tells us a whole lot right there. Clearly, the federal government was meant to do a small number of things. That infers a number we can count. On the other hand, Madison said most things would be left to the people of the states. So many things, we can't even count them all. But Madison didn't stop there. He went on to explain the basic scope of federal power, saying it would be exercised primarily on things like war, peace, negotiations with other nations, and foreign commerce. Madison called these external objects. Then he tells us that everything else is reserved to the states. Madison said state power encompasses all objects, which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. That means that almost everything is supposed to be handled at the state and local level, including healthcare, marriage, education, environmental protection, transportation, drug laws, and more. The list can go on and on and on. So the next time you're wondering if the federal government can do something, stop and think about which of Madison's categories it falls under. The answer is probably no. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. Most people today have absolutely no sense at all of how small the federal government is supposed to be under the Constitution. But a 19th century veto from President James Madison helps explain. Today, the feds are involved in just about everything. We take it for granted that they are supposed to be creating healthcare systems, regulating pollution, and even telling us what kind of light bulbs we can use. But the truth is, the feds aren't supposed to be doing any of those things. In fact, they shouldn't be doing most things they do today. Did you know the federal government shouldn't even be funding infrastructure? It might sound shocking, but it's true. Just look through the Constitution and you won't find any delegated powers relating to such a thing. In fact, James Madison actually vetoed a public works bill funding infrastructure in 1817, calling it unconstitutional. The bill was for constructing roads and canals and improving the navigation of watercourses in order to facilitate, promote, and give security to internal commerce among the several states. Virtually every American today would say that this is exactly what the feds should be doing. But the father of the Constitution disagreed. Madison said, "The legislative powers vested in Congress are specified and enumerated, and it does not appear that the power proposed to be exercised by the bill is among the enumerated powers, or that it falls by any just interpretation with the power to make laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution those or other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States. The amazing thing is that Madison actually favored the bill personally, but he vetoed it anyway because he put the Constitution above his personal policy preferences. That's the kind of integrity you should never count on from Washington, D.C. today. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. People often say they want a strong president who can get things done. But that's pretty much opposite of what the Founding Fathers set up under the Constitution. Before the American Revolution, colonial governors ruled with almost total authority. They had absolute veto power over legislatures and the authority to issue edicts that carried the force of law. They could create law with the stroke of a pen. It was basically the colonial version of executive orders, as they're so often used today. When the people declared independence and states began drafting their own constitutions, they vowed to end this kind of power. In a nutshell, the founding generation believed that only a radical destruction of that kind of authority in one person could prevent the resurgence of total power throughout the country. This carried over into the drafting of the Constitution. The royal governors represented the executive branch that the founders were most familiar with. Their experience with those guys was the reason they were determined to strictly limit presidential power. In fact, when famed founding-era legal expert St. George Tucker explained executive authority in his commentary on the Constitution, he wrote that we shouldn't even talk in terms of presidential powers, but we should more properly call them duties. James Madison also clearly defined the limited nature of presidential authority in an essay known as Helvidius No. 1. He wrote, "The natural province of the executive magistrate is to execute laws, as that of the legislature is to make laws. All his acts, therefore, properly executive, must presuppose the existence of the laws to be executed." Today, this wisdom has been flipped on its head. Where the founders rejected sweeping executive power, many Americans today embrace, and more dangerously, they often beg for it. Under the Constitution, the president was delegated the authority to execute laws passed by Congress, not create them with the stroke of a pen. Insisting that the Constitution has a fixed meaning isn't blind dogmatism. It's the cornerstone of the system created by the Founding Fathers. In 1767 and 1768, the English Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Townshend Acts. Several of the acts levied taxes, which were not only meant to raise revenue, but more generally to set the precedent that Parliament had the authority to tax the colonies. The Townshend Acts led to widespread protests in the colonies and sparked the cry, "No taxation without representation." The acts also included the New York Restraining Act, which shut down the colony's legislative assembly as punishment for its refusal to comply with the Quartering Act. In response to the Townshend Acts, Samuel Adams and James Otis wrote what became known as the Massachusetts Circular Letter. The thrust of their argument was that the taxes were unconstitutional because Massachusetts was not represented in Parliament. The Massachusetts House of Representatives gave official support to the letter in February 1768. Under pressure from British officials, the Massachusetts General Court refused to revoke this approval, and the governor responded by dissolving the assembly. That led to riots in Boston and ultimately the American Revolution. But the letter had an even deeper significance. In it, Adams and Otis laid out a principle that would form the foundation of American constitutionalism: that the meaning of a constitution cannot be altered by the whims of government. They wrote, "In all free states, the Constitution is fixed, and as the supreme legislative derives its power and authority from the Constitution, it cannot overleap the bounds of it without destroying its own foundation. That the Constitution ascertains and limits both sovereignty and allegiance." Today, many Americans embrace the opposite, and we see the results in a federal government that claims power over nearly every aspect of our lives. As Samuel Adams and James Otis warned, supporting the idea of a living, breathing Constitution has destroyed our foundation. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. Some people want you to believe that we should always defer to Washington, D.C. and conflicts between state and federal power. But they've pretty much got things backwards. St. George Tucker was a well-known founding-era jurist and legal scholar. He wrote the first extended commentary on the Constitution after it was ratified. View of the Constitution of the United States was published in 1803 and served as an important handbook for American law students, lawyers, judges, jurists, and statesmen for the first half of the 19th century. Tucker emphasized how conflicts between federal power and states or the people should be treated. He wrote, "The powers delegated to the federal government are, in all cases, to receive the most strict construction that the instrument will bear, where the rights of a state or of the people, either collectively or individually, may be drawn into question." In other words, if you have the choice of interpreting a given provision of the Constitution in a way that gives the federal government more power or in a way that gives it less power, you should always err on the side of limiting federal power and supporting the states or the people. Under the Constitution, the states and the people are supposed to get the benefit of the doubt, not the federal government. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. If you believe, like I do, that taxation is theft, you might be interested in what Samuel Adams had to say on the subject. Some people say that we should wait for the Supreme Court to overturn a federal law, rule, or regulation before we exercise our rights. Or they tell us we should spend our time pressuring the Congress to overturn laws they created. But Thomas Jefferson saw things differently. Here's what he had to say. "A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate." In other words, we the people need to exercise our rights whether the government wants us to or not. During the Massachusetts ratifying convention, a little-known founder made the case that the ultimate power resides with the people, and the combined tools of resistance and jury nullification can protect liberty even in the face of a government that won't follow the Constitution. Here's how Theophilus Parsons put it when he rose to speak on January 23, 1788. "The people themselves have it in their power effectually to resist usurpation without being driven to an appeal to arms. An act of usurpation is not obligatory. It is not law.
and any man may be justified in his resistance. Let him be considered as a criminal by the general government, yet only his own fellow citizens can convict him. They are his jury, and if they pronounce him innocent, not all the powers of Congress can hurt him, and innocent they certainly will pronounce him if the supposed law he resisted was an act of usurpation. I often say that voting the bums out is not just a failed strategy, but also the wrong one for what we're facing today. Thomas Jefferson had some interesting advice on this as well. He said that replacing politicians was the right strategy for an abuse of the delegated powers. Simply put, if the government is still operating within the confines of the Constitution, but just making bad policy decisions, then voting the bums out is the right approach. But when government assumes powers which have not been delegated in the Constitution, a different approach should always be used. How does that apply today? Well, if you look at the limits of the Constitution and compare it with what the federal government has been doing, I'd say the answer is pretty easy.